Now back to this focus on infrastructure. Town planning requires skilled planners, engineers, architects and infrastructure system developers. But how should we be planning for the future given extreme weather and population growth? To discuss this further now, we're joined by the Director of Spatial Planning with the Western Cape Government, Catherine Stone, who joins us virtually from Cape Town. Catherine, thank you so much for your time. Now, the Western Cape Government has very much been in the news over the last few weeks. There was just earlier this month big headline news: Western Cape Government adopting inclusionary housing policy, and that of course started the conversation all over again, a conversation that hasn't gone anywhere, especially in a place like the Western Cape, especially in a place like Cape Town, where too long the criticism has been that not enough is being done to address the legacy of apartheid government spatial planning and what's being done to bring that into the future, and more importantly provide the kind of housing that's needed by the citizens who use, all citizens who use that city. What do you make of the direction that the government is taking? Because obviously you're part of that team plotting a way forward. Firstly, how difficult was that, and what are the next steps now?
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Yeah, it is a really tough conversation, the one around spatial transformation, because it comes up against issues of land ownership, land use rights, and a great deal of profits to be made from that, and trying to break down these barriers between race and class in South Africa, and fears that are associated with that. So there are a lot of concerns. There are a lot of concerns around economic development and placing a burden on municipalities and on developers. But really, I suppose what we're trying to do in the Western Cape Government is get the conversation started, create a space where everyone understands what inclusionary housing is and why it should be considered. And really, with innovation in the concept is that we don't have a lot of money in this country anymore. And so we need to look for other resources to leverage. And in the Western Cape, for example, but in many of our metro cities, there's a great deal of value in land and land use rights that can be shared more equitably to build more inclusive cities. So it will be a tough conversation, but because it requires municipalities to commit some attention and capacity to it. But what it will also do is make them consider, well, what else could we do that might be easier to take spatial transformation and integration more seriously?
We've seen the stories that focuses on how the leaders in that province are getting things wrong, not just in that province, but because you're from the Western Cape, that's where our focus is right now. We know of areas like Woodstock and Salt River. We know, I saw recently a story about plans to redevelop or to develop farming grounds in the Philippi area. There's the River Club story, and the list goes on. But can you, as we've had this extended conversation around infrastructure in the country today here on eNCA, can you point us to successful projects that we can learn from and perhaps take forward?
Yeah, the successful examples are isolated pockets of excellence. I mean, I think that in Johannesburg, Cosmo City, which is quite old now, was a really good example of integrated development, both in relation to mixed income groups as well as mixed uses, and partnership between the public and private sector, and quite an innovative finance instrument. So I think that's a great example. I think Gautrain as well has a lot to say for itself, but I do think there were some missed opportunities. But we have to learn, and we have to do to learn, and that's what I suppose Gautrain offers us. You know, we also have well-governed municipalities who are doing the job they're supposed to do. And we always want to look for these flagship projects, but actually getting the basics right is really important from an infrastructure management point of view, both in terms of governance and planning, maintenance, etc. And local governments, well, all spheres of government tend to get quite distracted by chasing the next best project and not really focusing on keeping those basic systems running and adequately maintained, so that when you do have an extreme event, they're more resilient to that.
We're going to speak about the extreme event in a minute, but I want to bring you back to you pointing out the Gautrainer being a good example. Now, when you're dealing with the legacy of apartheid spatial planning, access to transport is extremely important. I mean, I'm from the Western Cape originally, and I know how important transport is for taking people from where they live or where the apartheid government threw them away to being able to take them to job opportunities or to where their work is. Do you think enough focus has been put on improving our transport infrastructure as a node in a bigger plan for a future spatial planning?
As planners, we've put a huge amount of focus on public transport and promoting development in the city and our settlements that encourages the feasibility of investing in public transport and making them more financially sustainable. So it's been extraordinarily disappointing, the collapse in governance of public transport systems. Cape Town used to have the highest share of rail passengers in the country, and the modal share split has been completely decimated in favor of taxis. And to recover those riders is going to be a huge effort at great expense. So it really is. I don't think it's a problem of planning. It's a problem of governance, a problem of how that system of governance has been structured from a national perspective as opposed to a decentralized perspective. And all the kind of competing forces around the resources that have meant the jobs that were promised haven't got done.
Now,
it's tragic.
Let's focus a bit now on those extreme events, as you mentioned it earlier. We saw, as an example, those floods that hit KZN a few months ago. One of the biggest issues pointed to by experts is because of the growth in the population of people making their lives in certain parts of, especially the low-lying parts of Durban. Those areas weren't ready for this extreme weather that hit them, and indeed extreme weather that is expected to continue to hit various parts of our country. How should we be planning for the future with regards to that extreme weather and, of course, population growth as well?
Yeah, it's tough keeping up with population growth, but we have pretty good predictions and projections, and our plans are quite comprehensive in building those in. But of course, we can't control how people come in and how fast they come into the cities and where they settle. And often very poor people will settle on more marginal areas like floodplains along rivers, etc. And we have that in all of our cities, and that puts them most at risk. And so I could give you a traditional answer that plans and people should avoid settling in areas of risk, particularly along coastlines and especially in floodplains. But these are often those spaces in between that people settle in when they first come to the cities, and where it's perhaps less easy to monitor. And so I think we need to work on a lot more empowerment and education of communities around the risks involved in settling in these areas, and programs of working with communities to develop more resilience and disaster preparedness that's not entirely reliant on the state, but within the communities themselves, particularly around fires and informal settlements too. So we need to get to ground and work with communities to build resilience and to build preparedness, but also to educate around these risks, at the same time as trying to create viable places for people to settle in, to attract people to that don't present the same kinds of risks, which is difficult considering the shortage of public land and well-located land in cities. Often these marginal areas are better located compared to some of the larger housing projects, for example.
Now, along with architecture, I do believe that spatial planners are probably of the most important skills that we need going forward, not just as a country, but as a global species. But town planning does require skilled planners, engineers, architects, and infrastructure system developers. And you have to be people who are not just interested or skilled in that specific sphere, but you're interested in the history of a place, and then, of course, what the plans for the future are for those people living there, and indeed how that fits into a national development plan, for instance, here in South Africa. Are these skills readily available? Do we see enough young people going into that, and more importantly, staying in the country to apply those newly acquired skills? Yeah,
that's a really good question, and it's got two aspects to it. So we we have had a flight of mature skills, and partly it's because government is very difficult to work for. It's a very contested terrain, and often professionals, the relationship between professionals and leaders is hostile because there's tension in the pressures that each face. And often in municipalities, professionals aren't valued, and the recruitment of professionals is not valued. So the problem is we do have a shortage of mature professionals. I think there are lots of graduates coming out. There aren't necessarily the positions being created for them to be able to enter into the system, and then you need mentorship to be able to support these young graduates to mature. And as you point out, it's really important for planning, because planning is a long-term exercise, that we're able to retain that talent, attract and retain that talent, because understanding a city and how it works and where best to intervene and how best to respond takes years. It takes years of understanding, as you say, the history and the systems and building relationships between different disciplines and different spheres of government to get the right responses. And so it's really important how planners are treated, and that they have mentors, and that the environment is conducive to them being able to have an impact and to be able to contribute to decision making, and to be respected for the value that they offer. So I think at the entry level, we do have graduates. We're not necessarily creating enough spaces for them to come into the system. At the more mature level, we do have challenges, particularly outside of the metropolitan cities, where they're most needed.